The world we inhabit today is one of constant luminescence. With the flick of a switch, we banish the night. Our cities, seen from space, are webs of glowing gold, defying the natural order of darkness. But to truly understand the heart of Christmas, we must peel back the layers of time, past the neon signs of New York City, past the gaslit streets of Victorian London, and back into a time when the night was a physical, heavy presence. Imagine an American landscape, thousands of years before it bore that name, or the deep, primordial forests of northern Europe. It is late December. The air is so cold it feels brittle, as if the world might shatter like glass. In this ancient world, the winter solstice was not just a date on a calendar. It was the most terrifying and sacred moment of the year. The great shudder of the earth to the ancient mind, the universe was a living, breathing entity. They watched the sky with a desperate intensity that we have largely forgotten. From the end of autumn, they watched the sun, their source of warmth, their bringer of life, sink lower and lower toward the horizon. Each day, the shadows grew longer. Each night, the frost bit deeper into the earth. There was a genuine, primal fear. What if the sun does not return? What if this time the darkness finally wins? This fear is the charcoal from which the first sparks of Christmas were struck. The humans of the stone, bronze, and iron ages did not have theology as we know it, but they had a profound sense of the great return. They knew that for life to continue, they had to call the light back. The Vikings and the Yule spirit let us travel to the rugged fjords of Scandinavia, the land of the Norsemen. Here, the winters are brutal and unrelenting. They called this season Jal, or as we know it, Yule. Picture a great Norse longhouse, built of heavy timber and sod. Outside, the great hunt was said to be screaming through the sky. The god Odin riding his 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, collecting the souls of the restless. To stay safe, families huddled together. This was the birth of the indoor holiday. The harshness of the American frontier in the 1700s would later mirror this. The idea that the home is a fortress against the winter. In the center of the longhouse burned the fire. But this wasn't just any fire. This was the Yule log. The men of the village would search for the largest, sturdiest oak or ash tree. It wasn't merely cut, it was ceremonially harvested. They believed the log held the soul of the sun. Bringing it inside was an act of invitation. They were bringing the warmth of the forest into the heart of the home. The ritual of the sap and spark as the log was dragged across the threshold. It was often sprinkled with grain or ale to ensure a good harvest in the coming year. The log had to be large enough to burn for 12 straight days. These 12 days of Christmas that we sing about today, they started here in the smoke and heat of a Viking hearth. As you listen to this, imagine the sound of that fire, the rhythmic crackle of the drying wood, the way the sap hisses, a sound the ancients believed was the tree singing its last song. They watched the sparks fly up toward the smoke hole in the roof. Every spark was a prayer. They would count them, one for a new calf, one for a new foal, one for a healthy child. They were not just keeping warm, they were practicing a form of sympathetic magic. By maintaining a miniature sun, the fire inside their home, they believed they were encouraging the real sun in the sky to regain its strength. When you see the twinkling lights on a house in a quiet American suburb tonight, you are seeing a 5,000-year-old instinct to keep the darkness at bay. The mystery of the evergreen while the deciduous trees, the oaks and maples, stood like skeletons against the gray sky, the ancients noticed a defiance in nature. The fir, the pine, and the holly, they remained vibrantly, stubbornly green. To the Germanic and Celtic tribes, these were not just plants, they were sacred. They were proof that life could survive the little death of winter. They began to bring boughs of these evergreens indoors. They weren't Christmas trees yet, but they were symbols of sanctuary. They believed that the woodland spirits, the fairies and the elves of the forest, would take refuge in the green needles to escape the killing frost. By bringing the greenery inside, the people were protecting the very essence of life itself. This connection to nature is something that resonates deeply with the American spirit. the reverence for the great outdoors, the stillness of a snowy forest, and the desire to bring that natural beauty into our living rooms during the darkest months. As the Yule fires of the north continued to roar, casting long, dancing shadows against the timber walls, we turn our gaze southward. We travel away from the frozen fjords and toward the golden, marble-clad heart of the ancient world, Rome. In the modern American mind, December is a month of shopping, snow, and family. But to a Roman citizen, December was defined by one word that still echoes through history: Saturnalia. The Roman carnival of liberty. If the Norse Yule was a struggle for survival, Saturnalia was a celebration of liberation. Beginning on December 17th and lasting for 7 glorious days, the Roman Empire underwent a radical transformation. This was the festival of Saturn, the god of agriculture and time, the deity who presided over the Golden Age, when all humans were equal and the earth provided plenty without toil. Imagine the streets of Rome, lit by thousands of flickering wax tapers called cerae. The strict social hierarchies that defined Roman life simply evaporated. This is a concept that deeply resonates with the American ideal of equality. During Saturnalia, the courts were closed and no war could be declared. But most remarkably, masters and slaves swapped roles. Picture a grand Roman villa. The master of the house would take off his formal toga, put on a simple, colorful tunic called a synthesis, and serve dinner to his servants. There was laughter, gambling with nuts instead of coins, and a sense of shared humanity that was rare in the ancient world. This spirit of the season, the idea that for 1 week we are all brothers and sisters, is the direct ancestor of the Christmas spirit we talk about today. The gift of the heart. It was also during Saturnalia that the tradition of gift-giving took root. Romans would exchange small terracotta figurines called sigillaria, or candles, or even gag gifts. They believed that by giving, they were ensuring the prosperity of the coming harvest. This wasn't the commercialized shopping of the 21st century. It was a symbolic exchange of goodwill. When you wrap a gift for a loved one today, you are participating in a ritual that has been practiced for over 2,000 years. You are saying, just as the Romans did, I see you, I value you, and in this dark month I offer you a token of light. The Druids and the mystery of mistletoe. While Rome feasted, another culture was practicing a much more mysterious ritual in the mist-shrouded oak groves of Britain and France. These were the Druids, the high priests of the Celts. To them, the winter solstice was the time of the healing of the sun. Their most sacred symbol was the mistletoe. Unlike any other plant, mistletoe grows without roots in the earth, living high in the branches of the sacred oak. Because it remained green and bore white berries even in the dead of winter, the Druids believed it was the essence of the sun captured in a plant. Imagine a silent, snowy forest. A Druid priest in white robes climbs an oak tree with a golden sickle. He cuts the mistletoe, which must be caught in a white cloth before it touches the ground. For if it touched the earth, its magic would vanish. It was hung over doorways as a charm for fertility and protection. The American tradition of kissing under the mistletoe is a soft, romantic echo of this ancient belief. It was a plant of peace. If enemies met under the mistletoe in the forest, they were required to lay down their arms and keep a truce until the next day. It reminds us that even in our most ancient past, we were looking for reasons to forgive and find peace. The rise of Sol Invictus. As the centuries rolled on, the Roman Empire began to embrace a new cult, Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. In the year 274 AD, Emperor Aurelian made it an official religion. They chose a specific date for the sun's rebirth, December 25th. They chose this date because, to the naked eye, it was the first day the sun clearly began its northward journey. The death of the sun was over. The rebirth had begun. This date, December 25th, became a focal point for the entire Western world. It was a day of victory, the victory of light over darkness, of life over the grave. the convergence of traditions as we conclude this second part of our journey through the shadows of the solstice. We see a beautiful tapestry beginning to form. From the Norse, we took the Yule log and the greenery. From the Romans, we took the feasting, the equality, and the gift-giving. From the Druids, we took the mistletoe and the reverence for the natural world. All these traditions were like small streams flowing into a great river. They were all searching for the same thing, hope. They were all looking at the cold, indifferent stars and saying, "We will not be afraid of the dark." But the world was changing. A new story was whispering across the Mediterranean. A story not of a sun in the sky, but of a child in a manger. In our next and final part of this chapter, we will explore how these ancient, pagan traditions met the rising tide of Christianity, and how they merged to create the holiday the world would eventually call Christmas. The stage was set. The fires of Yule were burning in the north, and the echoes of Saturnalia were still ringing through the streets of Rome. But as the centuries turned, a new narrative began to weave its way through the tapestry of human history. The ancient world, with its pantheon of gods and seasonal rituals, was about to meet a revolutionary idea that would reshape the winter solstice forever. The great synthesis in the first few centuries after the life of Jesus, the early Christians did not actually celebrate his birth. Their focus was on his death and resurrection. In fact, the Bible never mentions a specific date for the birth in Bethlehem. So, how did December 25th become the day that stops the world? The answer lies in a beautiful and strategic merger. As Christianity spread across the Roman Empire and into the wild lands of the Celts and Germans, the church leaders faced a dilemma. They wanted the people to embrace the new faith, but the people were deeply attached to their ancient winter festivals. They loved their Yule logs, their evergreen boughs, and their week of gift-giving. Instead of trying to abolish these traditions, the early church did something brilliant. They baptized them. They looked at the festival of the unconquered sun and said, "We are not celebrating the sun in the sky. We are celebrating the creator of that sun." The light of the winter solstice became a symbol for the light of the world. By the year 336 AD, under the reign of Emperor Constantine, the first recorded celebration of Christmas on December 25th took place in Rome. The transformation of symbols as you sit in your living room today, look around at your decorations. You are looking at a museum of human history. The tree, the ancient German paradise tree, merged with the Norse reverence for evergreens. What was once a sanctuary for forest spirits became a symbol of the tree of life from the Garden of Eden, decorated with apples, the first Christmas ornaments and candles to represent the stars. The holly, to the Druids, it was a protective plant. To the new Christians, the sharp leaves came to represent the crown of thorns, and the red berries symbolized the drops of blood, a reminder that the child in the manger was born to be a savior. The candles, the Roman cere became the Advent candles, representing the 4 weeks of waiting for the light to enter the world. This synthesis is what makes Christmas so universal. It is a holiday that speaks to our modern faith while simultaneously whispering to our most ancient, ancestral instincts. The American echo for the American audience. This history is particularly resonant. America is a melting pot, and so is Christmas. Our traditions are not from one place but from everywhere. The German settlers brought the tree to Pennsylvania. The English brought the carols and the mistletoe. The Dutch brought the legend of St. Nicholas. But even deeper than that, the shadows of the solstice remind us of the American spirit of endurance. Just as the ancients huddled together to survive the winter, the early pioneers and settlers of this land relied on that same communal warmth to build a new nation. The idea of home being a place of light in a vast, dark wilderness is a core part of the American story. The eternal quiet as we conclude this first chapter of our journey. Let the weight of history settle over you like a warm blanket. When you hear the wind rattle the window pane tonight, remember that you are not alone. You are part of a chain of humanity that stretches back to the very first fires in the very first caves. We have always been afraid of the dark, and we have always found a way to create light. The ancient roots of Christmas teach us that winter is not just a season of death, but a season of preparation. It is the quiet time when the seeds are waiting beneath the snow. The solstice has passed. The days are getting longer, if only by a few seconds. The ancient gods have faded into folklore, but the hope they represented, the belief that the light will always return, is more alive than ever. In our next chapter, we will leave the ancient forests and the Roman villas behind. We will travel to a small, dusty town called Bethlehem, where a single star would take the ancient longing for light and give it a name, a face, and a heart. The noise of the ancient world has faded. The roaring fires of the Norse longhouses and the rowdy streets of Roman Saturnalia are behind us now. To understand the next chapter of our story, we must travel across the Mediterranean Sea, away from the forests and the marble cities, and into a landscape of silver sands, rugged limestone hills, and a silence so profound it feels eternal. This is Judea over 2,000 years ago. The weight of the night in the modern world, we rarely experience true darkness. But in the hills surrounding the small village of Bethlehem, the night was a vast, velvet ocean. The stars were not just tiny points of light. They were brilliant, pulsing diamonds that seemed close enough to touch. As you listen to this, imagine the stillness of that desert night. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of dry earth, wild herbs, and the wool of sleeping sheep. There is no sound of engines, no hum of technology, only the rhythmic breathing of the earth itself. Judea was a land under tension. It was a province of the Roman Empire, occupied by soldiers and burdened by taxes. The people were weary. They were waiting. For centuries, their prophets had whispered of a new light, a ruler who would bring not just political freedom, but a peace that surpassed all understanding. They were looking for a king, but they never expected how that king would arrive. The journey of the weary, the road from Nazareth to Bethlehem, is roughly 90 miles, a grueling journey across rocky terrain and steep inclines. Imagine a young woman named Mary and her husband, Joseph. In the American tradition, we often see them on Christmas cards as serene and glowing, but the historical reality was one of exhaustion and grit. Mary was in the final stages of pregnancy. Every step on that dusty road was a testament to her strength. They were traveling not by choice, but because of a decree from Rome. A census was being taken, and every man had to return to his ancestral home. Joseph was of the house of David, and so Bethlehem, the house of bread, was their destination. Picture them arriving as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep violet and burnt orange. The village was overflowing with travelers. The inns were full, the courtyards were crowded. There was no room for a family in crisis. The humility of the grotto in the Middle East of that time. Stables were often caves carved into the limestone hills, used to keep animals safe from the wind. This is where the story takes a radical turn from the grandeur of ancient kings. There was no golden palace. There were no silk tapestries. The King of Kings was to be born in a place of dust, hay, and the breath of oxen. This humility is the very heart of the American Christmas spirit, the belief that greatness does not come from wealth or power, but from the lowliest of beginnings. As Mary labored in the dim light of an oil lamp, the world outside remained oblivious. The Roman soldiers patrolled the streets, the merchants counted their coins, and the rest of the village slept. But in that small, shadowed cave, a miracle was unfolding. When the first cry of the infant pierced the night air, it wasn't just a birth. It was the moment history split in two. The cradle of wood and straw Joseph took the child and wrapped him in swaddling cloths, long strips of linen used to keep an infant warm and secure. He placed the baby in a manger, a feeding trough for animals. Pause for a moment and consider that image. The creator of the universe, according to the story, resting in a wooden box meant for cattle. It is an image of profound peace. It tells us that no matter how humble our own lives may be, there is a sacredness in our existence. The straw was coarse, the wood was rough, but the love in that cave was the brightest light the world had ever known. The first witnesses, but a birth this significant could not remain a secret forever. While the important people of the world slept, the news was first delivered to the outcasts. On the outskirts of Bethlehem, on the windswept hills, lived the shepherds. In the social hierarchy of Judea, shepherds were near the bottom. They were rugged men, stained by the elements, living on the fringes of society. They were the ones who kept watch while the world dreamed. Suddenly, the silver silence of the desert was shattered, not by thunder, but by a radiance that the Bible describes as the glory of the Lord. The hills of Judea were a place of deep shadows and ancient silence. As we left Mary and Joseph in the quiet solitude of the grotto, we moved just a few miles away to the rugged slopes where the grass was thin and the wind had a lonely whistle. Here, the first grand announcement of Christmas would not be made to emperors or high priests, but to the shepherds, the sentinels of the night in the American cultural imagination. We often see shepherds as gentle figures on a mantelpiece, but the reality of a first-century shepherd was one of incredible toughness. These were men who lived entirely outdoors, their skin tanned and leathery from the sun, their eyes sharp from years of scanning the horizon for predators. They were the sentinels of the night, protectors of the vulnerable. Imagine them huddled around a small, dying fire. The only sounds were the occasional shifting of the flock and the crackle of dry brushwood. To these men, the night was a familiar companion, but it was also a place of danger. They knew every star, every gust of wind, and every sound of the wilderness. They expected nothing but the slow passage of time until dawn. The shattering of the silence suddenly, the familiar world vanished. The Bible tells us that the glory of the Lord shone around them. This wasn't a soft glow, it was a celestial intrusion. Imagine a light so pure and intense that it turned the midnight hills into high noon. For men who lived by the dim light of oil lamps and stars, this was terrifying. The Greek word used for their reaction suggests a shaking fear. They fell to the ground, shielding their eyes from a radiance they could not comprehend. And then out of the light came a voice. "Fear not," the messenger said. These are perhaps the most important words in the entire Christmas story. In a world filled with anxiety, war, and uncertainty, much like our own today, the message began with a call to peace. The angel told them of a great joy that was meant for all people. Not just the elite, not just the powerful, but for the rugged shepherd on a lonely hill and every soul who had ever felt forgotten. The symphony of the heavens then, the sky itself seemed to tear open. A multitude of the heavenly host appeared. If you have ever stood in an open field in the American Midwest or the deserts of the Southwest and felt small beneath the vastness of the Milky Way, imagine that entire sky filled with a symphony of light and sound. They sang of peace on earth and goodwill toward men. It was a proclamation that the division between the divine and the human had been bridged. The shepherds didn't wait to debate what they had seen. They didn't ask for proof. In a beautiful display of simple faith, they left their flocks, their only source of livelihood, and ran toward the village. The encounter in the quiet picture the shepherds entering the town of Bethlehem. The streets were dark, the travelers were asleep in their tents, and the only sound was the distant braying of a donkey. They searched through the shadows until they found the stable. When they stepped inside, the contrast must have been breathtaking. Outside was the memory of blinding celestial glory. Inside was a flickering lamp, a tired mother, a protective father, and a baby sleeping in a feeding trough. There is a profound lesson here for the modern listener. The greatest miracles often happen in the quietest places. The shepherds didn't find a king in a golden robe. They found a family that looked just like them, humble, weary, and full of love. They knelt in the hay, their rough hands perhaps trembling as they looked at the child. In that moment, the sacred turning point became personal. They left the stable not as outcasts, but as the first messengers of a new era. The peace that settles as you listen to this, let the peace that the shepherds felt wash over you. The story of Bethlehem is a reminder that light does not always arrive with a trumpet blast. Sometimes, it arrives as a heartbeat in a quiet room. But while the shepherds were celebrating in the valley, something else was moving across the vast horizons of the east. Deep in the libraries of Persia and Babylon, men of immense wisdom and wealth had seen something in the stars that defied explanation. A new light had appeared, a star that didn't follow the rules of the heavens. While the shepherds returned to their flocks, their hearts still echoing with the songs of angels, another journey was unfolding thousands of miles away. This was not a journey of a few hours across a hillside, but a trek of many months across treacherous deserts, jagged mountains, and ancient empires. This is the story of the Magi, or as they are known in American tradition, the three wise men. The watchers of the skies in the ancient lands of Persia and Babylon, there were men who dedicated their entire lives to the study of the heavens. These were not mere fortune tellers. They were the scientists and philosophers of their age. They believed that the movements of the planets and stars were a divine language, a celestial map of human destiny. Imagine a high observatory tower in the cool night of the east. These wise men, traditionally named Melchior, Caspar, and Balthazar, noticed something that broke all the laws of astronomy. A new star had appeared. It didn't drift like a comet or flicker like a dying sun. It pulsed with a steady, commanding brilliance. To them, this was the king's star. For an American listener, there is something deeply relatable in the journey of the Magi. It represents the great American road trip in its most spiritual form. The willingness to leave everything familiar behind and follow a distant light toward an unknown promise. The long caravan, the journey of the Magi, was an immense undertaking. It wasn't three men on camels alone. It was a vast caravan. They had to carry enough water for the desert, guards to protect them from bandits, and supplies for a journey that likely took over a year. Picture the caravan moving across the vast, silver dunes under the moonlight. The camels' steady, rhythmic footsteps in the sand, thump, 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 a sound that could lull a traveler into a trance. They traveled mostly at night to avoid the scorching sun and to keep their eyes on their celestial guide. The Star of Bethlehem was not just a light, it was a beacon of hope. For months, they followed it westward. They crossed the Euphrates, navigated the Syrian deserts, and finally reached the gates of Jerusalem. The meeting of two worlds. When the Magi arrived in Jerusalem, their presence caused a stir. Here were wealthy, foreign dignitaries asking for a newborn king. They eventually met King Herod, the Roman-appointed ruler of Judea. This moment in the story highlights a profound contrast. Herod represented the old world, power through fear, gold, and soldiers. The Magi were looking for a new kind of power, power through love and divinity. Herod's palace was cold and suspicious, but as the Magi left Jerusalem, the star reappeared, leading them to the quiet, humble village of Bethlehem. The gifts of destiny. When the star finally stopped over the place where the child was, the Magi did not find a prince in a palace. They found a toddler in a simple house. Yet these powerful, wealthy men did not hesitate. They bowed down in the dust. They opened their treasures and presented gifts that were deeply symbolic. Gold, to recognize his royalty, the king of a kingdom not of this world. Frankincense, a precious incense used in temples, recognizing his divinity and the prayers of humanity. Myrrh, an oil used for anointing and burial, a bittersweet reminder that this child's life would be defined by sacrifice. For the modern American audience, this is the origin of our Christmas gift-giving. It wasn't about consumerism. It was about offering the very best of ourselves to something greater than us. It was an act of recognition and humility. The return. By another way, the story ends with a warning. In a dream, the Magi were told not to return to Herod. They took a different route home, avoiding the darkness of the palace. This returning by another way is a metaphor for the entire Christmas experience. Once you have seen the light, Once you have experienced the peace of that quiet night, you cannot go back to being the person you were before. You are changed. The fading light as we close this chapter. Imagine the star slowly fading into the light of a new dawn. The shepherds are back with their sheep. The Magi are on their long journey home, and the small family in Bethlehem is safe. The sacred turning point has been reached. The ancient world of fear and shadows has been met with a message of joy to the world. The silence of the desert night has been replaced with a promise that will echo through the ages. The journey of the star is over, but the journey of the heart is just beginning. As you drift toward sleep, remember that same light, the light that guided the wise men and comforted the shepherds, still shines in the kindness we show to one another and the hope we carry for the future.
When we think of early American history, we often imagine a land of religious freedom, a sanctuary for those seeking to practice their faith without fear. But if you were to step back in time to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the mid-1600s, you would find a version of Christmas that would shock the modern American. There were no trees. There were no carols. There were no twinkling lights. In fact, if you were caught celebrating Christmas, you wouldn't be greeted with a Merry Christmas. You would be met with a fine, or perhaps even a seat in the public stocks. The Puritan irony. The story of Christmas in America begins with a paradox. The Puritans, who fled England to escape religious persecution, became the very people who outlawed the most famous Christian holiday. To understand why, we must look at the world through their eyes. To the Puritans, Christmas was not the holy day we perceive today. They looked at the Bible and found no mention of December 25th. They saw the holiday as a human invention, a remnant of the Roman Catholic Church and, even worse, a thin veil for ancient pagan rituals. But their biggest grievance was not theological, it was behavioral. In 17th century England, Christmas had become a time of misrule. It was a rowdy, boisterous, and often violent carnival. Men would dress in women's clothes. The poor would wassail, a form of aggressive caroling, at the doors of the wealthy, demanding food and liquor. And public drunkenness was the norm. The Puritans saw this as a direct affront to God. When they landed on the shores of New England, they were determined to leave that heathenism behind. The law of the land. In 1659, the General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony passed a law that made the celebration of Christmas a criminal offense. The decree stated, "Whosoever shall be found observing any such day as Christmas or the like, either by forbearing of labor, feasting, or any other way, shall pay for every such offense 5 shillings as a fine to the county." Imagine an American December in 1660, while the wind howled across the Atlantic and the snow piled high against the timber cabins of Boston. It was a day of mandatory work. Blacksmiths hammered at their anvils, merchants kept their shops open, and children sat in cold schoolrooms. To the Puritans, the best way to honor God on December 25th was to treat it like any other Tuesday. This was the silent Christmas, not a silence of peace, but a silence of enforcement. The authorities would roam the streets, sniffing the air for the scent of roasting goose or listening for the sound of a forbidden song. If a home was too festive, the heavy hand of the law would knock on the door. The resistance in the shadows. But human joy is a difficult thing to suppress. Even in the heart of Puritan New England, there were those who remembered the old ways. In the privacy of their cellars, or in the deep woods, some families would still exchange a small token or whisper a prayer. Meanwhile, just a few hundred miles to the south, in places like Virginia and New York, then New Amsterdam, the story was very different. The Anglican settlers in the south and the Dutch in the north maintained their love for the season. While Boston was cold and silent, the Dutch in New Amsterdam were honoring Sinterklaas, and the Virginians were decorating their homes with holly and hosting grand balls. This created the first culture war in American history, a divide between the strict Samba North and the festive, traditional South. For over a century, America was a house divided by the spirit of Christmas, the revolution of the heart. As the decades rolled into the 1700s, the strict grip of Puritanism began to loosen. New immigrants arrived from Germany, Ireland, and Scotland, bringing with them their own vibrant traditions. They brought the idea of the Christmas ham, the Christmas tree, and the belief that the birth of Christ should be a day of communal joy, not just a day of labor. But a new challenge was coming, a challenge that would test the very survival of the colonies and, in an ironic twist, use the distraction of Christmas to change the course of world history. The prohibition of Christmas in New England did not end with a sudden shout, but with a slow, creeping thaw. As the 18th century dawned, the rigid walls of the Puritan city upon a hill began to crack. But the true turning point, the moment Christmas moved from a religious debate to a pillar of American identity, happened during the most desperate hours of the American Revolution, the Christmas miracle of 1776. If you were to ask an American in 1776 what Christmas meant, they wouldn't talk about a holiday. They would talk about a gamble. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, was on the verge of collapse. They were hungry, their boots were falling apart in the snow, and morale was at an all-time low. Across the Delaware River, in Trenton, New Jersey, sat a formidable force of Hessian mercenaries, elite German soldiers hired by the British. Washington knew that the Hessians would be celebrating Christmas. In the European tradition, they would be drinking, feasting, and letting their guard down. On the night of December 25th, 1776, Washington made a move that would become legendary. In a blinding storm of sleet and snow, he led his men across the icy river. This was Christmas used as a tactical shield. The victory that followed the next morning saved the revolution. But for the soldiers, it did something more. It linked the concept of Christmas with the concept of American liberty. It was the first time the entire nation, from the strict Northerners to the festive Southerners, felt a collective heartbeat on that specific day. The post-revolutionary identity crisis. After the war, America faced an identity crisis. The new nation wanted to distance itself from British traditions. Since Christmas was seen as an English holiday, its popularity actually dipped for a while. In the early 1800s, Christmas in cities like New York and Philadelphia became chaotic. It wasn't the family-friendly day we know now. It was more like a rowdy street protest. Young men would roam the streets in Calathumpian bands, making as much noise as possible, demanding free liquor from the upper classes. The holiday was at a crossroads. It was either going to vanish into history as a forgotten relic or become a dangerous annual riot. America needed a new way to celebrate. The Knickerbocker influence. Enter a group of New York writers and thinkers known as the Knickerbockers, led by the famous Washington Irving. In 1809, Irving wrote a satirical history of New York, but in it, he did something profound. He reinvented the image of St. Nicholas. Instead of a stern European bishop, Irving described a jolly, pipe-smoking Dutchman who flew over the treetops in a wagon. Irving's writings began to soften the American heart. He painted pictures of cozy, English manor houses where families gathered around fires and old grudges were forgotten. He was essentially marketing a new kind of Christmas, one that wasn't about public rioting or strict religious silence, but about the family. He argued that in a fast-paced, growing America, we needed a day to stop, go home, and reconnect with our roots. This was the birth of the Victorian Christmas in the American imagination, even before Queen Victoria had taken her throne. The changing landscape of the American home. By the 1830s and 40s, the Industrial Revolution was changing the American landscape. People were moving from farms to cities. The old ways of community celebrations were fading. In this time of rapid change, Christmas offered a sense of stability. The holiday started moving from the street to the parlor. This shift was crucial. When Christmas moved inside the home, it became a holiday centered on children. This was the era when the first Christmas cards began to appear and when the Forbidden Noel of the Puritans officially became a relic of the past. The stage was set for the final transformation from a cultural tradition into an official law of the land. By the mid-19th century, The forbidden nature of Christmas had almost entirely evaporated, but the holiday still lacked a unifying American soul. It was practiced differently in the North than in the South, and it wasn't yet recognized by the government. It took the darkest chapter in American history, the Civil War, to truly cement Christmas as the national holiday of the heart. The Christmas of the divided house. In 1861, as the United States tore itself apart, soldiers on both sides found themselves spending their first Christmas away from home. For a young soldier in a muddy trench in Virginia or a cold camp in Tennessee, Christmas was a painful reminder of everything he was fighting for and everything he stood to lose. Historical records from the Civil War tell us something beautiful and haunting. On Christmas Eve, despite being enemies, Union and Confederate soldiers would often call out to each other across the lines. There were tobacco truces, where men would crawl into no man's land to exchange coffee for tobacco. In the silence of the winter night, a Union band might play Home, Sweet Home, and from the other side, the Confederate soldiers would begin to sing along. In those moments, the holiday transcended politics. It became a bridge for the American public back home, seeing their sons long for the peace on earth that Christmas promised made the holiday more sacred than ever before. The war didn't destroy Christmas. It made it an essential part of the American psyche. Thomas Nast and the Union's secret weapon. During this time, a famous illustrator named Thomas Nast began publishing drawings in Harper's Weekly. In 1862, he drew a picture of Santa Claus visiting a Union Army camp. Santa was dressed in a suit with stars and stripes, handing out gifts to soldiers. President Abraham Lincoln reportedly called this version of Santa the best recruiting sergeant the North ever had. These illustrations gave Americans a visual language for the holiday. It was no longer just a religious day or a rowdy street festival. It was a symbol of unity and hope. Nast's Santa became the definitive American image of the holiday, a jolly, benevolent figure who cared for the well-being of all, especially those in hardship. The path to 1870, a federal decree. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the country was in a period of reconstruction. The nation was broken, grieving, and searching for ways to heal the wounds of a 4-year slaughter. One of the ways the government sought to reunite the North and the South was through common cultural traditions. By 1870, the pressure to make Christmas an official holiday reached the White House. People wanted a day that wasn't about work, politics, or division, but about family and national peace. On June 28, 1870, President Ulysses S. Grant signed the legislation that made Christmas an official federal holiday. It was a monumental moment. The day that had once been outlawed by the Puritans was now sanctioned by the highest office in the land. It was no longer the Forbidden Noel. It was officially America's Christmas. The modern legacy, from outlaws to icons, the journey from 1659 to 1870, is a testament to the American spirit's evolution. We began as a people of strict, often harsh, religious discipline, and we grew into a nation that realized the necessity of joy, compassion, and communal rest. Today, when an American worker gets the day off on December 25th, they are enjoying a right that was fought for through centuries of cultural struggle. Whether it's the Rockefeller Cemetery in New York, a quiet church service in a small town in Kansas, or a family gathering in a sun-drenched home in California, the holiday carries the DNA of our entire history. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about that long road. Think of the Puritan blacksmith working at his anvil to prove his faith, the Revolutionary soldier crossing the icy Delaware to secure his freedom, and the Civil War, mother praying for her son's return by the light of a single candle. They all contributed to the eternal glow we feel today. The Forbidden Noel is forbidden no more. It is the light that. The mid-1800s were a time of profound transformation. The world was vibrating with the hum of the Industrial Revolution. In America and England, cities were swelling. Factories were coughing smoke into the winter air, and the gap between the rich and the poor was becoming a yawning chasm. The old, rural ways of celebrating the solstice were fading, replaced by the cold, hard logic of the marketplace. But in the year 1843, A small book was published in London that would act as a spiritual lightning, bolt across the Atlantic. That book was Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, the prophet of the poor. Charles Dickens was not just a writer. He was a man who had felt the sting of poverty in his own childhood. He saw the dark satanic mills of the era and the way. Children were treated as mere cogs in machine. He feared that the spirit of charity was dying. Imagine a cold, foggy London night, the kind of fog that Dickens described as breathing down the throats of the city's inhabitants. Enter Ebenezer Scrooge, the personification of the cold, unfeeling side of the industrial age. Scrooge's famous bar, humbug, wasn't just a grumpy remark. It was a rejection of human connection. To Scrooge, Christmas was a budget leak, a waste of time and money. When Dickens sent his 3 ghosts to visit Scrooge, he wasn't just writing a ghost story for the fireplace. He was writing a manifesto for the human heart. The Ghost of Christmas Past showed us that we are shaped by our memories. The Ghost of Christmas Present showed us the joy of a simple meal at the Cratchit table. And the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come showed us the terrifying loneliness of a life without love. The Dickensian fever in America. In America, Dickens was a superstar. When A Christmas Carol reached American shores, it spread like wildfire. Americans, who were busy building a new capitalist empire, found a mirror in Scrooge. The book taught a young nation that the true meaning of profit wasn't found in a ledger, but in the business of mankind, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence. Dickens effectively invented the modern idea of the Christmas dinner. Before this book, there was no universal tradition of the family turkey or the gathering of the poor and wealthy. Dickens argued that for one day, we should look at our fellow travelers as passengers to the grave and not a different race of creatures. This philosophy would soon be put to the ultimate test in the most brutal conflict America had ever seen, the shadow of the 1860s. As the 1840s and 50s passed, the spirit of Dickensian charity began to settle into American homes. But by 1861, the eternal glow of the holiday was threatened by the smoke of gunpowder. The United States was no longer a unified family. It was a house divided, brother against brother, North against South. For the soldiers of the Civil War, the ghosts of Christmas past were not spirits, they were the memories of their mothers, wives, and children back home. As December 1861 approached, the boys in blue and grey realized that their first Christmas in the field would be unlike anything they had ever known. Imagine a young soldier from Ohio or Georgia, shivering in a thin wool coat, sitting by a campfire that barely keeps the frost at bay. His Christmas feast is a piece of hardtack, a brick-like biscuit, and perhaps a small slice of salted pork. He pulls a crumpled letter from his pocket, reading it for the 100th time by the flickering light. He isn't thinking about the humbug of the war. He is thinking about the empty chair at his family's table. This was the era when Christmas became homesickness personified. The songs of the era, like Home, Sweet Home, became the anthems of the trenches. It was in this atmosphere of extreme suffering that the spirit of Christmas Present would perform miracles that no general or politician could have commanded. The American Civil War was a conflict of unprecedented scale, a tragedy that touched every family from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi. But as the winter of 1862 and 1863 settled over the battlefields, a strange phenomenon began to occur. The ghosts of Christmas past started to haunt the trenches, but instead of bringing fear, they brought a temporary, fragile peace, the truce of the carols. Imagine the Rappahannock River in Virginia. On one side sat the Union Army of the Potomac, on the other, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. They were close enough to hear each other coughing, close enough to smell the smoke of each other's fires. During the day, they were sharpshooters aiming for each other's hearts. But as Christmas Eve arrived, the atmosphere shifted. A Union regimental band began to play. They played the Star-Spangled Banner, and the Confederate side answered with a chorus of Dixie. It was a musical duel, a defiant display of national pride. But then, something miraculous happened. The Union band began the soft, familiar notes of Home, Sweet Home. The battlefield fell into a stunned silence. Then, a Confederate band joined in. Thousands of men, who had been trying to kill each other hours before, began to sing together in the freezing dark. In that moment, the ghost of Christmas present took the form of a shared melody. The war was still there. The politics were still there, but for 3 minutes. They were just men who missed their homes. Decorations of desperation. For the soldiers, celebrating Christmas was an act of rebellion against the misery of war. Since they had no ornaments, they used what they had. They would take a small cedar or pine branch and decorate it with hardtack biscuits, salt pork, and even salt-encrusted bayonets. Some soldiers wrote in their journals about lighting up the camp. They would stick candles into the muzzles of their rifles and line them up along the trenches. This image, a weapon of death, used as a candlestick for the light of peace, is perhaps the most powerful symbol of Christmas in American history. It was a literal manifestation of the biblical prophecy, "They shall beat their swords into plowshares." The miracle of the picket lines. There are numerous accounts of picket line truces. On Christmas morning, a Union soldier might shout across the frozen ground, "Hey Johnny, Merry Christmas, no shooting today." And a voice would drift back from the Confederate side, "Merry Christmas, Billy Yank, no shooting from us if you don't." For a few hours, the war stopped. Men met in the middle, the no man's land, to trade. The Union soldiers had plenty of coffee and sugar but lacked tobacco. The Confederates had plenty of tobacco, but had been drinking coffee, made of roasted acorns for months. They exchanged goods, showed each other photographs of their wives and children, and sometimes even played a game of baseball in the snow. The Dickensian influence in the field. The spirit of Charles Dickens was very much alive in these camps. Officers would often try to provide a grand feast for their men, even if it was just an extra ration of beans or a small piece of fruit. It was called a Christmas dinner. Dickens had taught the world that the Cratchit family could be happy with very little as long as they had each other. The soldiers became each other's Cratchit family. They formed bonds of brotherhood that were forged in fire but softened by the holiday. They shared their meager rations with the Scrooges of the camp and told stories of Christmases past until the fire died down to embers. These moments were small, but they were vital. They reminded the American people that even in a house divided, the foundation was still made of the same human spirit. But as the war dragged on into 1864, the ghost of Christmas yet to come began to cast a darker shadow. The cost of the war was mounting, and the hope for a home for Christmas was becoming a bittersweet dream for many. As the smoke finally cleared from the battlefields in 1865, America was a changed nation. The ghost of Christmas, yet to come, had left a trail of empty chairs in almost every household. The country was grieving, and the wounds of the Civil War were deep, jagged, and slow to heal. It was in this atmosphere of national mourning that the legacy of Charles Dickens and the shared experience of the soldiers merged to create something new. The American Christmas of reconciliation. The Dickensian return. In the winter of 1867, just 2 years after the war's end, Charles Dickens himself returned to America for a legendary reading tour. He was older now, and his health was failing, but his spirit was as vibrant as ever. Thousands of Americans flocked to see him, waiting in long lines in the snow just to hear him read the story of Ebenezer Scrooge. When Dickens stood on the stage in New York and Boston, he wasn't just a British author. He was a healer, as he voiced the transformation of Scrooge from a man of cold stone to a man of as good a heart as the old city ever knew. The American audience saw a reflection of their own need for transformation. The North and the South were like the estranged members of a family, and Dickens' message of charity, mercy, and benevolence became the social glue that helped hold the broken pieces of the Republic together. The sacredness of the empty chair. During this post-war era, the ghost of Christmas past took on a more solemn meaning. This was the time when the memorial Christmas began. Families started the tradition of placing a wreath or a candle in the window for those who didn't come home from the war. In America, Christmas became the day when we honored our history while looking toward the future. The soldiers who had shared coffee and carols across the picket lines were now the leaders of their communities. They brought back the realization that their enemies were, in fact, their brothers. This sentiment moved into the American church and the American home. The humbug of sectional hatred was slowly replaced by the glow of a shared national holiday. The final transformation, a national soul. By the late 1800s, the influence of Dickens and their memory of the Civil War truces had achieved something the Puritans could never have imagined. They made Christmas holy through humanity. It was no longer just about a religious decree. It was about the spirit of the season, a term that became part of the American vocabulary. We began to see the rise of the community Christmas tree and the giving tree in American towns. The idea was simple. No one should be a Scrooge, and no one should be a Tiny Tim left behind in the cold. This era solidified the American tradition of Christmas charity, where organizations like the Salvation Army began their work on the street corners, ringing bells that echoed the bells of Dickens' London. The legacy in your heart. As we end this chapter, think about the ghosts that visit you each December. We all have a Christmas past, the memories of childhood, the smell of pine, and the faces of those who are no longer with us. We have a Christmas present, the opportunity to be kind, to put down our weapons of daily stress and political anger, and to share a meal with those we love. And we have a Christmas yet to come, the hope that the peace the soldiers felt for a few hours in the trenches of the Civil War can one day become a permanent reality for the world. Charles Dickens once wrote of Scrooge, "It was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well. If any man alive possessed the knowledge, through the fire of the Civil War and the magic of a storyteller's pen, America learned how to keep Christmas well. It learned that the holiday is a sanctuary, a place where the past is honored, the present is cherished, and the future is always bright with the eternal glow." The image is so familiar it feels as if it has existed since the dawn of time. A jolly, portly man with a snow-white beard, dressed in a crimson suit trimmed with fur, sliding down chimneys with a sack full of toys. To a modern American child, Santa Claus is as real as the snow on the ground. But the Santa we know today did not fall from the sky fully formed. He was carefully, and sometimes accidentally, designed over centuries, becoming the ultimate masterpiece of American folklore. The saint from the sands, Nicholas of Myra. To find the heartbeat of the legend, we must leave the North Pole and travel back 1,700 years to the sun-drenched shores of what is now Turkey. There lived a man named Nicholas, the Bishop of Myra. Nicholas was not a man of the snow, but a man of the people. He was famous for his secret acts of generosity. The most famous legend tells of a poor father who had 3 daughters but no dowry for them, which in those days meant a life of hardship. Under the cover of night, Nicholas tossed 3 bags of gold through the man's window. Some say they landed in stockings hung by the fire to dry. This is the DNA of Santa Claus, the secret giver. When Nicholas died, his fame spread across Europe, and he became the patron saint of children and sailors. In the Greek and Russian traditions, he remained a serious, holy figure. But as his story moved toward Holland, he began to change. Sinterklaas and the Dutch connection. In the Netherlands, Saint Nicholas became Sinterklaas. He was still a bishop, wearing a tall red hat, mitre, and carrying a golden staff. But he gained a magical element. He rode a white horse over the rooftops, and had a book that recorded the behavior of every child. When Dutch settlers arrived in the New World in the 1600s, establishing New Amsterdam, which we now call New York, they brought Sinterklaas with them. But in the melting pot of early America, something fascinating happened. The strict English Puritans, whom we met in Chapter 3, hated the idea of saints. But the broader American public loved the idea of a gift bringer. Through a series of linguistic slips and cultural blending, Sinterklaas began to sound like Santa Claus to the English-speaking ears of New York. But he still didn't have his reindeer, his sleigh, or his belly that shook like a bowl full of jelly. For that, we needed the poets. The poet's pen, Clement Clarke Moore. On a snowy night in 1822, a professor named Clement Clarke Moore sat down in his home in Chelsea, New York, and wrote a poem for his children. He titled it A Visit from St. Nicholas, though the world knows it today as the night before Christmas. More took the various European legends and unified them into a single, magical narrative. Before this poem, Santa was often described as a tall, thin bishop or even a tiny elf. More gave us the definitive blueprint. He gave Santa a sleigh and 8 reindeer, and he gave them names like Dasher, Dancer, and Vixen. He described him as chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf. He introduced the idea of Santa coming down the chimney, a nod to old hearth spirits but made friendly. This poem was a turning point. It moved Santa Claus out of the church and into the nursery. It made the holiday about the magic of childhood. Across the growing United States, families began to read this poem every Christmas Eve, a tradition that remains a cornerstone of the American holiday experience. But while Moore gave Santa a personality, he hadn't yet given him a face. For that, America needed an artist. If Clement Clarke Moore gave Santa Claus his spirit through poetry, it was an immigrant artist named Thomas Nast who gave him his soul and his physical form. Nast, a German-born illustrator for Harper's Weekly, is arguably the most influential architect of the American Christmas. Between the 1860s and the 1880s, Nast created a series of drawings that transformed Santa from a tiny elf into a human-sized, iconic hero, the face of the nation. Thomas Nast began his work during the dark days of the Civil War. His first drawings of Santa were political. They showed a Santa who supported the Union, a figure of morale for soldiers shivering in the trenches. But after the war, Nast's focus shifted to the domestic and the magical. It was Nast who first drew Santa in a heavy, fur-trimmed suit, while the suit wasn't always red in the early black and white etchings. It was often described as tan or brown fur. The silhouette was unmistakable. He gave Santa the broad belt, the big black boots, and that grandfatherly face, a mix of wisdom and mischief. Nast was the first to show Santa in his workshop, surrounded by toys, carefully carving wooden horses for the children of a recovering America. The mystery of the North Pole, one of the most profound contributions Thomas Nast made to the legend, was giving Santa a permanent address. Before Nast, no one knew exactly where Santa lived. Some thought he came from heaven, others from Spain or the snowy mountains of Europe. In a famous 1866 illustration, Nast drew a map and labeled it the North Pole. At the time, the North Pole was a place of mystery and wonder for the American public. It was the era of great Arctic explorations, a final frontier that no human had yet conquered. By placing Santa's workshop there, Nast gave the legend a sense of untouchable magic. For a child in a growing, industrial city like New York or Chicago, the North Pole was the ultimate sanctuary. It was a place where time stood still, where the only industry was the creation of joy, and where the naughty or nice list was maintained with absolute fairness. This added a layer of morality to the legend. Santa wasn't just a gift giver. He was a watchful, benevolent guardian of childhood, the invention of Santa's mail. Nast also introduced the concept of letters to Santa. He drew scenes of children posting their letters in mailboxes, or Santa reading them by a fireplace. This was a revolutionary shift. It gave American children a voice. It allowed them to participate in the holiday, to express their desires, and to feel a personal connection to the legend. This tradition grew so powerful that the U.S. Postal Service eventually had to create a special system to handle the millions of letters addressed to the North Pole. It is a testament to the power of Nast's imagination that a simple drawing in a magazine could create a national postal phenomenon that lasts to this day. The commercialization of the icon. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, Santa Claus was no longer just a character in a poem or a magazine. He became the face of the emerging American retail world. Department stores like Macy's began to realize that if Santa Claus was in the store, parents would bring their children, and if the children were happy, the parents would shop. The first store Santas began to appear in the 1890s. This brought the legend into the physical world. For the first time, a child could sit on Santa's lap, feel the velvet of his suit, and hear the ho, ho, ho in person. This physicality made the legend indestructible. Santa was no longer just a ghost of Christmas past. He was a living, breathing part of the American economy and family life. But there was still one final piece of the puzzle missing. While everyone agreed Santa was jolly, his official colors were still debated. Some saw him in green, some in blue, and some in brown. The world was waiting for the final, vibrant red that would define him forever. By the early 20th century, Santa Claus was already a superstar in the American imagination. He had the reindeer from Moore's poem and the North Pole Workshop from Nast's illustrations, but he was still a bit of a chameleon. In some magazines, he appeared as a tall, thin man. In others, he looked like a spooky, gnarled elf. The final, definitive brushstroke, the one that created the Santa you see on every street corner today, came from a surprising place: the world of American advertising, the Great Depression and the red suit. In 1931, America was in the grip of the Great Depression. People were struggling, and the mood of the country was somber. During this time, the Coca-Cola company wanted to increase its sales during the winter months. As soda was traditionally seen as a summer drink, they hired a talented illustrator named Haddon Sundblom to create a series of advertisements featuring Santa Claus. Sundblom's task was to create a Santa who was wholesome, realistic, and symbolic. He didn't want a cartoon or an elf. He wanted a man who looked like your favorite grandfather. He used his friend, a retired salesman named Lou Prentice, as his initial model. Sundblom gave Santa a human glow, twinkling eyes, rosy cheeks, and laughter lines that felt warm and welcoming. Crucially, Sundblom dressed him in a bright, vibrant scarlet red suit with white fur trim. While it is a myth that Coca-Cola invented the red suit, as we saw with Nast earlier, it was Sundblom's paintings that standardized it, because these ads were printed in massive magazines like the Saturday Evening Post and displayed on billboards across the country. This specific version of Santa became the official Santa in the eyes of the public. The evolution of the reindeer, Rudolph the Outsider. As Santa's image became solid, his team also grew. In 1939, another piece of the legend was added by a copywriter named Robert L. May, who worked for the Montgomery Ward department store. He wrote a story about a reindeer who was an outsider, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. This story was a quintessentially American tale of the underdog. Rudolph, with his glowing nose, was teased by others but eventually became the hero who saved Christmas. This added a layer of emotional depth to Santa's world. It taught children that being different was a gift, not a curse. When the story was turned into a song in 1949 by Gene Autry, it became an instant classic, cementing Rudolph's place next to Dasher and Dancer forever, the global ambassador of joy. After World War II, the American version of Santa Claus went global. Through movies, television specials like Miracle on 34th Street, and international trade, the Sundblom style, Santa became the face of the holiday from Tokyo to London to Rio de Janeiro. He became a symbol of a specifically American type of optimism, the belief that no matter how dark the year has been, there is a jolly old soul who rewards goodness and brings light to the world. He represents the eternal child in all of us, the part that still wants to believe in magic, even when we are grown. The legacy of the legend. As we conclude this chapter on the designing of a legend, take a moment to realize the power of collective imagination. Santa Claus is a character built by a 4th century bishop, a 19th century poet, a Civil War artist, and a 20th century advertiser. He is a mosaic of history, art, and commerce. When you see a child's eyes widen at the sight of a red suit this December, you aren't just seeing a person in a costume. You are seeing the culmination of 1700 years of human storytelling. Santa Claus reminds us that we have the power to design our own heroes, and that the most enduring legends are they, ones that remind us to be generous, to be joyful, and to never stop looking at the night sky with wonder. As the fireplace embers glow and you prepare for sleep, imagine the soft sound of sleigh bells in the distance. The legend is alive, not because he is real in the physical sense, but because he is real in the way he makes us feel, a bridge between the world of what is and the world of what could be.
The journey of Christmas has been a long one. We have traveled from the flickering Yule fires of ancient forests, through the humble cave in Bethlehem, and past the cold bands of the Puritans. We have seen how poets and artists crafted a legend that captured the world's heart. Now we arrive at the threshold of the modern era, a time when the eternal glow of Christmas faced its greatest trials and achieved its most profound expressions of peace, the radiance of the 20th century. As the 1900s dawned, America was transforming into a global powerhouse. Cities were rising into the clouds, and for the first time, electricity began to replace the candle. This was the era when the visual Christmas we know today was born. In 1931, in the midst of the Great Depression, a group of construction workers at the site of the Rockefeller Center in New York City pooled their money together. They bought a modest 20-foot balsam fir and decorated it with strings of cranberries and tin cans. It was a small gesture of hope in a time of extreme economic despair. They didn't know then that they were starting a tradition that would become a global symbol of the American Christmas. Today, when that massive Norway spruce is lit with over 50,000 LED lights, it isn't just a display of wealth. It is a continuation of that original spirit, a declaration that even in the shadows of tall buildings and busy lives, we must make space for the light, the Christmas of the greatest generation. But the true test of the American legacy of peace came during World War II. For the millions of Americans serving overseas, Christmas was a tether to their humanity. In 1941, just weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood on the White House balcony with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to light the national Christmas tree. Roosevelt's words that night resonate with a deep, quiet power even today. He spoke of the right of the child to have a happy Christmas in a world at war. For the soldiers in the foxholes of Bastonia or the jungles of the Pacific, the song "I'll Be Home for Christmas" became a prayer. It was a bittersweet melody, a promise that even if they couldn't be home physically, they were there in their hearts. The post-war glow, the golden age of family. When the war ended, America entered an era of unprecedented domestic warmth. The 1950s saw the birth of the suburban Christmas. This was the time of the aluminum tree, the classic holiday television specials, and the gathering of 3 generations around a single television set. For the greatest generation, Christmas was the ultimate reward for their sacrifice. It was a time to rebuild, to nurture, and to celebrate the simple peace of a quiet neighborhood. This era solidified the idea that Christmas is, above all, a sanctuary. It is a day when the world stops its relentless spinning, and for 24 hours, the only thing that matters is the people sitting across the table from you. As you listen to this, think about that silence, the silence of a snowy street on Christmas morning. It is a peace that was earned through centuries of struggle, and it is a peace that we are tasked with protecting today. As the 20th century transitioned into the 21st, the world began to move at a dizzying pace. The silence that once defined the winter months was replaced by the constant hum of the digital age. In an era of instant communication and relentless productivity, one might wonder, does the silent night still have a place in the modern American soul? The resistance against the rush. In today's America, the weeks leading up to Christmas can often feel like a frantic race. The glow of the smartphone screen often rivals the glow of the hearth. Yet the true power of the American legacy of peace lies in its ability to force us to slow down. Think of the Christmas Eve service in a small town in the Midwest, or a candlelit vigil in a bustling city like San Francisco. When the lights go out and the first notes of a carol rise, the modern world, with all its noise, politics, and stress, simply falls away. For those few moments, we are not consumers, we are not employees, and we are not divided by our opinions. We are simply humans, standing together in the dark, holding a small light. This resistance of peace is a vital part of the American experience. It is the one day of the year when the open signs on the shops go dark, and the highways fall silent. It is a collective national deep breath. It reminds us that our value is not measured by what we produce, but by how we love and how we rest. The melting pot of traditions. America has always been a great experiment, a place where different cultures blend into something new. In this modern era, the eternal glow of Christmas has expanded to include a tapestry of voices. We see this in the way neighbors celebrate. In many American neighborhoods, you will see Christmas lights twinkling next to Hanukkah menorahs, or families sharing a Noche Buena dinner of tamales, alongside traditional roast beef. This isn't a dilution of the holiday. It is the ultimate fulfillment of its promise. If the original message of the star was peace on earth and goodwill to all, then the modern American Christmas is a living laboratory of that message. We have taken a European tradition and infused it with the spirit of the entire world. When we wish someone a Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays, we are acknowledging a shared human desire for hope and a new beginning, the spirit of giving in the modern age. The Dickensian legacy we discussed earlier has found its modern home in the countless American charities that come alive in December. From the angel trees in shopping malls to the local food banks, the American Christmas is a season of profound generosity. Image, a modern American. Volunteer handing out gifts to children in a community center during Christmas. For many, the most peaceful moment of the holiday isn't receiving a gift, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing they have helped a stranger. This is the secret peace, the realization that we are all connected, and that a small act of kindness in a cold month can warm a heart for a lifetime. As the snow begins to fall in your imagination, consider the millions of small lights in millions of windows across the United States. Each one represents a story, a family, and a hope. In the next and final part of our journey, we will look at the philosophical legacy of this silent night, and why, after thousands of years, we still need this story more than ever. We have come to the end of our long journey through time. We have seen the shadows of the ancient solstice, the brilliance of the Bethlehem star, the resilience of the Forbidden Noel, and the warmth of the legends we designed. Now, as the embers of the fireplace turn into a soft, pulsing orange glow, we must ask ourselves, what is the final legacy of this silent night? The philosophy of the small light. In the vastness of the American landscape, from the rugged peaks of the Rockies to the quiet marshes of the Carolinas, there is a shared understanding that Christmas is more than a day. It is a philosophy of the small light. The world can often feel cold and indifferent. History shows us that empires rise and fall, wars come and go, and technology changes the way we breathe. But for thousands of years, the human spirit has insisted on one thing: the light will return. Christmas is our collective way of saying that the darkness does not have the final word.
This is the American legacy of peace. It is a peace that doesn't depend on the absence of trouble, but on the presence of hope, like the soldiers in the Civil War who sang together across the river, or the construction workers who built the first Rockefeller tree during the Depression. We choose to celebrate even when it is difficult, especially when it is difficult. The sacredness of the present moment. As you prepare for sleep, think about the silence of this very moment. In the grand timeline of history we have explored, your life is a precious flickering flame. Christmas reminds us to cherish the now. It invites us to put down the heavy burdens of the past and the anxieties of the future. The true silent night is found when we realize that we have everything we need right here. It is in the sound of a loved one's breathing, the weight of a warm blanket, and the knowledge that we are part of a story that is much larger than ourselves. The eternal glow. Why does this festival stay in our hearts? Why do we continue to tell these stories? Because we need to be reminded that we are capable of great kindness. We need to remember that once a year, the whole world agrees to try a little harder to be good. The legacy of Christmas is a legacy of return. The sun returns to the sky. The traveler returns to the home. The heart returns to its capacity for wonder. As the American poet Robert Frost once wrote about the woods on a snowy evening, we have promises to keep and miles to go before we sleep. But on this night, the miles are forgotten. The promises are kept. A final blessing. The eternal glow is now yours to carry. It is in the way you will wake up tomorrow with a slightly lighter heart. It is in the patience you will show to a stranger and the love you will give to your family. The story of Christmas never truly ends. It just changes form. It moves from the pages of history into the actions of your daily life. And so, as the stars watch over the quiet American night, and the snow, real or imagined, settles upon the roof, let the peace of the centuries envelop you. The fires of Yule have been lit. The star has led the way. The silent night has arrived. Merry Christmas to all, and to all a peaceful, deep, and restorative night.